Hey guys, it's Casera, and today I'm going to be doing my February reading wrap-up. February, I read 21 books, and my last wrap-up was pretty long when I read about 20 books also, so I'm going to try and do this one a little bit faster. So as always, I'm going to start with my reading stats for the month. So we're going to start with the category. So in the month of February, I ended up reading 2 contemporary books, 13 fantasy books, 2 historical fiction, 2 romance, and 2 classics. This is actually pretty surprising for me because I don't really read that much historical fiction or romance, but I think in the month of February with Valentine's Day and Black History Month, those sort of things came a little bit more into play for me. Then we're going to talk about star rating. So my average star rating was 4.3 stars, which is pretty good for me. Though I will say I had fewer 5-star books than I typically do because I only had 4 5-star books, and of those 4 5-star books, half of them were rereads. So like I really only had 2 5-star books that I read for the first time in February. So that was a little bit of a bummer for me. But I did have 2 4.75 star books, 6 4.5 star books, 4 2.5 star books, 1 4-star book, 1 3.75 star book, 1 3.5 star book, and 2 3.25 star books. Then looking at it by age range, I had 16 adult books, 2 new adult, and 2 young adult books, which is surprising because I didn't read any middle grade, and then I read 2 new adult, which I don't often read new adult, but then again, that's probably mainly the romance side of it showing through there. Next, I'll talk about the source of my books, so where I get my books. So 8 of the books were owned books that I physically own. 10 were borrowed from the library, usually from the Libby app. 1 was from Audible, and 1 was from NetGalley. And then next is by medium. So I ended up reading 4 hardcover books, 5 paperbacks, 1 ebook, and 11 audiobooks. I feel like this is a pretty good ratio because I only read 1 audiobook more than the hardcovers, paperbacks, and ebooks all put together, which is really good for me. So I'm really happy with that one. Next, I'll put a little chart up on the screen over here with the page counts, but my average page count for the month was 474 pages, with the 300 to 400 and the 400 to 500 range tying for most number of books at 6 books each. Then by author's gender, I think this is a new one that I added this month. I ended up reading 11 books by male authors, 9 by female authors, and 1 book that was written by multiple, both a male and a female author. Then by ethnicity, I ended up reading 15 books by white authors, 5 by black authors, and 1 by a Hispanic author, which is much better than last month where I only had 1 book by an author who was not white. So at least there's a little bit progress made on that one. Then by country of origin, so I read 13 books from the United States, 3 from the UK, 1 from Canada, 2 from Poland, which is of course the Witcher series, 1 from the Ukraine, and 1 from Mexico. And really quickly, I'll just put a little pie chart up here with all the different authors that I read by. The only real standouts in this one are Joe Abercrombie and Andrzej Sapkowski because I read 2 books by both of those authors. All the rest of the authors I read only 1 book by, which I think is pretty impressive because I tend to like binge read series. And then next I'm gonna put a little chart on the screen here so you can see kind of the publication dates for the books that I've read, and they're kind of all over the place. A lot of them are from the last couple of years, but there are some dating back all the way to the 1800s, 1 from the 1950s, so it's kind of a pretty big spread, which I'm pretty happy with that variety as well. And lastly, by publisher, I was pretty surprised this month that I had so many books by Harper, but as always, I have quite a bit by Orbit because for some reason they seem to be my new favorite publisher because I'm reading so many books by them. It does help that they have published both the First Lost series and the Witcher series. So yeah, that's where most of those come from. So those are all the stats that I'm currently tracking. Let me know in the comments how many books you've read in the month of February and if there are any other stats you think I should look at. The next thing we're going to talk about is my rereads for the month. So I ended up rereading 2 books in the month of February. The first one was Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. This is one of my favorite books of all time. I featured it in my favorite romance novels, which I posted also in the month of February because this one is my favorite romance novel of all time. So of course I was just in the mood for it, so I decided to reread it. I also watched the movie, by the way, which was fantastic. It was my first time seeing the movie for this one, but I really loved it. I love Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. It is definitely a great romance like that I highly recommend if you want to read a good romance novel. And I can see why there are so many books that are based off of Pride and Prejudice, and people do Pride and Prejudice retellings just because of how iconic this book is, and I absolutely love it. And of course, I ended up giving it 5 stars. My other reread for the month was The Shadow Rising by Robert Jordan. This is the 4th book in the Wheel of Time series, and I'm rereading the Wheel of Time series on audio. I'm doing a very, very slow reread of it. So this one I started back in October, and I ended up finishing in the month of February. I enjoyed it so much. This is one of my favorite series of all time. The Shadow Rising is when we get really into the culture of the Aiel, which is like one of my favorite fantasy races, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it, and I'm excited to continue on with my reread of the series, and I ended up giving this one 5 stars as well. So I didn't read any nonfiction, and I didn't have any DNFs for the month of February, so we're gonna move on to my reading challenges. The first challenge we're gonna look at is my Unwrapped book challenge. So for those of you who don't know, this challenge is based off of a shelf that I have in which I have a bunch of books that are wrapped in gift wrap, and these are books that I wanted to unhaul at one point, and I decided to give one last chance to. So I have to pick 2 books in a month to unwrap and read in that month, and if I don't read the books, then I have to unhaul them. So these are the 2 books that I unwrapped in the month of February. The first one is The Shape of Water by Guillermo del Toro. This one I didn't enjoy as much as I was hoping to. I really wasn't expecting a whole lot from it, but I was really hoping that I would at least feel the romance of this book a little bit more than I did, which I didn't. I did feel kind of the historical side of this a lot, which I liked the historical side of it, but I really feel like the historical side of this book wasn't really saying very much. That being said, it did have some interesting characters, and it did hold my attention to the end of the story, and it had some interesting themes that I enjoyed, so I ended up giving it 3.25 stars. The other book that I unwrapped was Wicked Saints by Emily A. Duncan. This is a YA fantasy book that came out last year that I got in an Owl Crate box. I just wasn't that interested in it, so I never ended up picking it up. Based off of Goodreads reviews from people that I follow that I have very similar taste to, I just realized that this is probably just not the book for me, and I was reading a bunch of other stuff that I really wanted to read, so unfortunately this one is going to be an unhaul for me. Now we're going to talk about my fantasy book series challenge. So every month I pick out 2 fantasy series from this little mug over here. I have a bunch of fantasy series in that I've been meaning to read for a while, and these are the 2 books that I picked out in the month of February. So the first book I read was Shaman's Crossing by Robin Hobb, and I think so far out of all of the fantasy books that I picked out of my mug, this is my favorite one so far. By the way, Robin Hobb is an author that I really love. I read her entire Realm of the Elderling series last year and really, really enjoyed it. It was one of my favorites of all time. So I was pretty excited for the Soldier Sun trilogy, which is her other series that she has written, even though I hadn't heard as good things about this series, and I did really enjoy the beginning. It gave me similar vibes to Assassin's Apprentice, which is the first book in the Farseer trilogy, which is the first trilogy in her other series, and it also kind of gave me a little bit of Name of the Wind vibes as well, because this series is about a character named Navarre, who is the second son of a second son, which means he's supposed to be the soldier son, and in this book he goes to a training academy, so that's why I was getting like similar vibes to Name of the Wind, which is set in a university, because you get to see kind of like all of the other students and like their interactions and things like that. I really enjoyed this because there are a lot of social and political issues that are brought into the story, and it's just a very detailed atmospheric writing that I really love. And while the plot didn't quite do it for me in this book, I am excited to continue on with the series, and I ended up giving it 4.25 stars. And the other one that I ended up picking up was Prince of Thorns by Mark Lawrence. This is the first book in the Broken Empire trilogy, which I believe is the first trilogy that Mark Lawrence published, and I wasn't expecting much from this book because I had DNF'd it twice before. It's following a character named Prince Jorg, who is estranged from his father, the king, who has a new wife and has a new son, and basically doesn't want him to live anymore because he doesn't want him to be heir to the throne, but he's still alive, and he is fighting in this war because he wants to be king, and he is not a good person. Like, he is the ultimate anti-hero, and this is a great grimdark fantasy because of that, but I do think his character is a little bit of a caricature, and while the plot was very fast-paced and fun to read. I do think this book is lacking a little bit in world building and atmosphere, so I ended up giving it 3.75 stars. That being said, I am really excited to continue on with the rest of the series and to read more by Mark Lawrence. And now it is time to talk about all of the other books that I read in the month of February. So I'm going to start with my lowest rated book and work my way up to my highest rated. So the first book that I want to talk about is The Wedding Date by Jasmine Guillory. This is an adult romance novel with a biracial couple that started out really strong for me because the two main characters meet when they get stuck in an elevator together, and the guy is on a way to this wedding in which his date recently backed out on him, so he asks her to go with him, and they kind of start a relationship based off of that. And the very beginning was incredibly fun to read, but once I got to like the middle section, the conflicts in the story just didn't really work for me as well, and I ended up giving it a 3.25 stars. The next book that I want to talk about is Pride by Ibi Zoboi. So this one is a YA Pride and Prejudice retelling set in Brooklyn, New York. And one thing I really enjoyed about this novel is the culture and the uniqueness of the voice, because the main character is a Black Haitian Dominican. She has a very unique voice, and I love her because of the voice that she has and because she is somewhat of an unlikable character. That being said, it is very much a Pride and Prejudice retelling. It's very obviously a retelling based off of like the names and just things like that kind of took me out of the story. I think I would have liked it a little bit more if it had kind of been a little bit more of its own thing and not so obviously retelling, because I feel like it didn't quite do Pride and Prejudice the justice that it deserves, because Pride and Prejudice is one of my favorite books of all time, and this one, it didn't have the same themes and just feel to it as I would expect from a Pride and Prejudice retelling. So while I did enjoy it for what it was, in my head I kept comparing it to Pride and Prejudice, and that really got me out of the story and made me not feel as much for the characters, so I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. The next book I want to talk about is Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward. So this novel is a contemporary fiction that's written kind of like literary fiction, and it has some magical realism aspects to it. This one was a little bit harder for me to get into, but I ended up really enjoying the characters, and this book gets really dark, especially towards the end, but it was definitely one of those books that's a little bit harder to get into, and even though I enjoyed it, I think it's one that was a little bit out of my comfort zone. I do think this author is an incredible writer, and I'm excited to read more by her in the future, and I ended up giving this book 4 stars. The next book that I ended up reading was Daughter from the Dark by Marina and Sergey Dyachenko. This book is about DJ Aspirin, who is coming home at night one day, and he finds this orphan girl on the street named Alona, and he takes her in only to find the next morning that she is claiming to be his long-lost daughter, even though there's something definitely supernatural about her, and everything she's saying is not true, but yet somehow turns out to be true. It is a little bit twisty and definitely a little mind-bendy. I did a whole review on this book, so I will link that up in the cards for you guys if you want to check that out. This book was a little bit different than I was expecting, because I have read a previous book by these authors, Vita Nostra by Marina and Sergey Dyachenko, which is also really mind-bendy and atmospheric, and I really loved that about it. This book didn't have the same sort of atmospheric quality to it as their previous book. It was a little bit more down to earth. So because of that, I was expecting a little bit more of a down to earth plot from it, which I didn't really get. So it didn't work for me as well as their previous book, and I ended up giving it 4.25 stars. The next book I'd like to talk about is Serpent and Dove by Shelby Mahurin. So this book, I went into it not really knowing very much about it. This was a very hyped book, both on YouTube and especially on Instagram. I think I noticed this book a lot more than on YouTube. That might just be the people that I follow though. So that's why I got really into the hype because of that. So I ended up picking this book up without really knowing very much about it. And I really wish I had known a lot about it before picking it up, because it is extremely romance fueled fantasy book that, even though it's marketed as a YA, I do feel like it's more of a new adult book than a YA book. It's about a witch who gets herself into a situation in which she has to end up marrying a witch hunter, and she's on the run for her life at this time. So she really just wants his protection, and well, they're like a little bit of attracted to each other, but it's a witch and a witch hunter, so they can't be together, but at the same time, you kind of want them to be together. I did really enjoy this book. I've enjoyed this book a lot more physically though than the audiobook. The audiobook really didn't work for me. There were definitely sections of this book that kind of annoyed me a little bit because it was just so immersed in the romance section of it, and there were times when I really didn't feel like this was a fantasy book at all, but I really loved the ending to this book, and I ended up giving it 4.25 stars. So the next book I'd like to talk about is The Drawing of Three by Stephen King. So this is the second book in the Dark Tower series, and I really didn't think that I was gonna like this book, and that's because I didn't like the first book. The first book in the Dark Tower series is The Gunslinger, which I DNF'd like 6 times before I finally finished it, and I ended up giving it 2 stars. Only got that second star because of the ending. That last chapter I really liked in The Gunslinger, and well, The Drawing of Three starts right after that last chapter, and it takes in all of this good stuff from that last chapter and just completely expands on it, and I absolutely loved that aspect of this. It is definitely one of the grittiest, darkest fantasies that I've read. I thought I had read grimdark fantasy before I read this book. There are definitely parts of this book that made me incredibly uncomfortable, but like in a good way, sort of, maybe. If you don't like grimdark fantasy, I don't recommend this book, or if you don't like horror, because this was kind of like a mix between grimdark fantasy and horror, and it was so good and I really enjoyed it. There was definitely more from this book that I wanted that I didn't quite get, especially towards the end, so that's why I ended up giving this one 4.25 stars. And I also made progress on the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie. I ended up reading both Red Country and Sharp Ends by Joe Abercrombie. So first of all, Red Country is the 3rd standalone novel in the First Law world, also the 6th book set in the First Law world. This one is following mainly the character Shy. She's not one of my favorite characters, but of course it's a First Law book and it's dark and gritty, just in the right places, which I really loved. I didn't like the ending as much as I hoped I would, because I feel like the ending in this one was building up since like the beginning of the first standalone novel, which is the 4th book in the First Law series. I was really excited for it when I realized that this book was going in that direction, and then it was slightly anticlimactic for me, which is why I ended up giving this one 4.5 stars. Then I also read Sharp Ends by Joe Abercrombie, which is a series of short stories set in the First Law world, and this is the 7th book that is in the First Law series. And I do have to say, short stories aren't my favorite. I'm very much a long game reader, not a short game reader, and short stories are very short game material. That being said, I did enjoy most of the stories in this, and the very last short story in this one, I absolutely loved. Like, it was definitely one of my favorite moments in the First Law world, and I'm really happy to have read this book as well, and I ended up giving this one 4.25 stars. So the next book that I want to talk about is The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates. So this book is a sort of historical fantasy novel. It's definitely more historical than fantasy, featuring the Underground Railroad, which I found incredibly fascinating. I loved every aspect of the history that this book really depicted very well, and I loved how the fantasy elements were woven into the story. It was really well-built plot and world that I really enjoyed, and I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. The next book that I'd like to talk about is Heart of Flames by Nikki Palpretto. So this book came out in February. It came out on February 11th. It is the sequel to Crown of Feathers by Nikki Palpretto, which I read last year and I absolutely love. If you have been watching my channel at all, you probably know about this book because I talk about this series all the time. It's set in a world that used to be ruled by fierce Phoenix Rider queens, but now Phoenix Riders are very rare, and the main character, Veronica, wants to become a Phoenix Rider. So in the first book, she has to pretend to be a boy to fit into this group of Phoenix Riders, and a lot of stuff happens. There's a ton of lore and history that is thrown into the first book that I really loved, and I absolutely loved the ending, and this book picks up right off at the end of the first book, and it definitely fills in a lot of things that I was really excited for in this book. But I feel like I didn't like the plot of this book as much as the first books, because I was just waiting for something great to happen, and I feel like there was a lot of things that did happen, but it didn't quite go as far as I wanted it to. So while I did really enjoy this book, and I ended up reading it like super fast, like I read it in 2 days and I really enjoyed it, I had really high expectations of this book that I didn't quite meet. I still really enjoyed this book, and I did a full review on it, so if you're interested, I will link that up in the cards for you guys. But I definitely did enjoy this book, and I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. So the next book that I'd like to talk about is The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. So this book is from the 1950s, and it definitely portrays a lot of themes to do with the civil rights movement. And it's about a black man who journeys from the Deep South to Harlem, New York, and he encounters a lot of different things and has a lot of interesting experiences. This is definitely a very kind of mind-bendy book. It almost feels like a series of short stories in the way that he encounters things. Each chapter seems completely different from the last one. It is one of those books that I can't tell if it's like absolutely brilliant or written by a completely mad person, but I loved every second of it. I loved the writing in this book. The writing was incredibly gripping the entire time. I listened to this book on audio, and the audiobook narrator is fantastic. It is a fantastically produced audiobook, and every time I turned it on, I was just in the middle of the scene the entire time, and I loved it. There are tons of things that happen in this book that will just blow your mind, and I really enjoyed it. That being said, I don't really know what to think about this book. It was one of those books where like I got to the end and I was just kind of like, what just happened? Like I had no idea really. And while I did really enjoy this book, I'm still somewhat confused about what happened in that book. So I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. So next I want to talk about the Witcher series. I ended up reading both The Tower of Swallows and The Lady of the Lake by Andrzej Sapkowski. So this is the fourth and the fifth novels in the Witcher series, the last two novels in the series, and I really enjoyed these ones. I think these were my two favorite books in this series. I think the third novel, Baptism of Fire, is when I started really getting into the series, and by Lady of the Lake, I was completely sold. I feel like in these two novels, you really got to know the characters, and there was tons of great action, and I just absolutely loved it. I love Geralt and Yennefer, and especially Ciri. Ciri is definitely my favorite character in this series. She is incredibly powerful, especially in Lady of the Lake. I love her character arc in Lady of the Lake, and I'm really excited to watch the show. Like, I haven't seen the show yet, but I really want to start it. I said I would start it once I finish Lady of the Lake, so it's gonna happen soon, and I'm really excited for that. I ended up giving The Tower of Swallows 4.5 stars and Lady of the Lake 5 stars because it is fantastic and it is a great end to a great series. The next book that I'd like to talk about is The 10,000 Doors of January by Alex E. Harrow. So this is a portal fantasy following the character named January. She's really out of place in the world that she lives because she has kind of a darker skin tone, but she is being raised sort of as a ward to this wealthier white man. And this book is set in America in 1901. So it is definitely not in a time in which darker skinned people are really accepted in those sort of societies. When she's a child, she finds this door that goes to this other place, and she also finds this journal that is called The 10,000 Doors that explains sort of what these doors are, and there's the story inside the journal as well, and it is just incredibly written. I love the way that it is going back and forth between the story in the journal and January's story, as well as just the atmospheric writing of this book and the unique voice that January has. I just absolutely loved every second of this, and while it was a little bit of a slower read for me, I really enjoyed reading it, and I ended up giving it 4.75 stars. The next book that I'd like to talk about is Dead House Gates by Steven Erikson. So this is the second book in the Molassen Book of the Fallen series. It took me a while to read this book, but I really enjoyed it. I feel like in this book, I really started to get to know the characters a lot better than I did in the first book, and I loved the ending of this book. The ending of this book is so well done. It just opens up kind of my imagination to what this series could be, and it just makes me really excited for the rest of the series. Just based off of some of the things that happen in this book, this series could potentially be one of my favorite series of all time. It is definitely one of those series that takes a little bit longer to get into than some other series, but I'm really enjoying it, and I love the world building in the series. It has some of the most fantastic world building that I've ever read, and I'm really excited to continue on with it. And I ended up giving Dead House Gates 4.75 stars. And lastly, my favorite book that I read in February. I think this one's gonna be a little bit of a surprise for you guys because it's Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McKiston. And it's a surprise because this is a romance novel, which I almost never read romance novels, and if I do, they don't end up as one of my favorite books, but I absolutely loved every second of this. This is a male-male new adult romance novel between the first son of the United States and the Prince of Wales, and it was fantastically written. I love all the social political issues in this book and how it's brought out, even though the romance was definitely the main aspect of the story, and the romance really, really worked for me. I think what worked the most in this novel for me was the humor, because I almost never get humor in novels. Actually, I usually hate it when authors try to be humorous because a lot of times I just don't care and it just doesn't work for me. But this novel had me laughing out loud multiple times while I was reading it, and I absolutely loved it, and I ended up giving it 5 stars. I also did a full review on this one, so I'll link that up in the cards for you guys if you want to check it out. So that is all I have for you guys. If you've read any of these books, please let me know down in the comments because I would love to discuss it with you guys. I post videos every Monday, Thursday, and Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern time, so consider subscribing. I also post bonus videos, so if you want to be notified as soon as I upload, you can click that little bell icon. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up to support my channel. All social media links are in the description down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.